polling, you actually saw that by a significant number, many more white Americans were willing to acknowledge problems in the criminal justice system based on race.
Why do we have to wait on them though?
Well,
Speak our truth to power.
you know, what this comes down to is what I said earlier, which is how do you build coalitions to actually get stuff done? Because the truth of the matter is that in very few places are African Americans a majority of the vote. It's just simple math, right? So in right where we're sitting right now in Washington D.C., that would be the case. But there are not a lot of states, and there are a handful of cities where just the black vote delivers the power then to actually bring about concrete change. So as a consequence, then you've got to pay attention to how other folks are feeling. That may be frustrating sometimes. And as I said, that's not the job of everybody. The job of a writer like a James Baldwin or a Ta-Nehisi Coates, the job of a preacher, the job of an activist. When I was a community organizer, I'm thinking differently about what I'm communicating because I'm trying to mobilize a particular segment of my community, right? But when we are talking about politics, particularly at the state or federal levels, well, you need to be able to persuade some white folks who are not going to think like you. And you may want to say things exactly the way you want to say it, but they may not hear it.
Yikes.
And if they don't hear it, then it's not going to help you. I mean, listen. One thing that I think is absolutely important to recognize is that even people who are not in any way consciously anti-black, they don't want to be seen as the bad person. They're always going to be a little defensive. That's human nature. In the same way, by the way, that Charlamagne, you may be able to relate to this more as a man. Like, if women start talking to men about their issues, a lot of men will get very defensive very quickly and say, that's not me. I treat my woman good, or I'm not the problem, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And
Or if they're smart, will listen and make adjustments.
yes,
But the woman has to be allowed to be able to speak that truth to power.
of course, but listen.
And listen, you part of the book you talk about that. That's what I was going to ask you next.
Right.
Right. You talk about the women on your team and them having issues with men interrupting them constantly and taking their ideas and making it their own. And as a matter of fact, as that was happening, they were feeling so intimidated by it that they didn't even want to speak anymore sometimes because of that. And that was something that you guys had to address. And I feel like that's something that happens in the workplace all the time to this day. So
Absolutely. But part of what had to happen was the women had to bring it to me. Then we all had to talk about it. I had to get educated on what was happening because a lot of times this wasn't happening in front of me. As I said, the guys would be on their best behavior a lot of times in front of me, but in meetings where I wasn't in, suddenly you had some of these macho attitudes coming up. My point is that as we think about social change, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about sexual orientation, this stuff is deep in everybody, right? We all have all these attitudes that have been built up over time, what we learned from our parents, what we learned from our communities, our neighborhoods. And there are times where the best thing to do is just be blunt and say, you know what, you are being racist or you are being sexist. There are times where the better thing to do is, listen, I understand, you've got your own issues and this is, I think you mean well, but let me tell you like how this is interpreted by me, right? And in each of those situations, and there's no formula, right? You're trying to figure it out at any given time. How can I get other people to see my reality in a way that leads them to change their behavior, leads them to support changes in laws and institutions? And, uh, you know, but as you quoted, that's frustrating, right? You'd prefer not having to do this at all. I'm not the first person to write about the fact that it is sometimes exhausting to feel as if you got to educate folks about just being treated normally and fairly. Like, I prefer not having that legacy that we have to deal with.
With reading this book and all that you did for every community, including our own community, how do you take it when you hear, especially African Americans, minorities, say that they feel that President Barack didn't do enough for minorities, or didn't do enough for Black people?
Black people.
What are your thoughts on that?
You know what? I understand it because when I got elected, there was so much excitement and hope. And I also think that we generally view the presidency as almost like a monarchy, in the sense of, well, once the president's there, he can just do whatever needs to get done. And if he's not doing it, then it must be because he didn't want to do it.
Well, we see it with Trump, though. So he does what he wants to do, so people assume.
Well, right, because he breaks laws.
Right.
And or disregards the Constitution. But look, I think that anybody who goes into public life, they need to understand that, yeah, you're going to get criticized, because that's just the nature of it. If you don't want that, then you shouldn't be in that business. The good news for me was that I was very confident in what I had done for Black folks, because I had the statistics to prove it, right? So by the time I left office, you had seen 3 million African Americans have health care that didn't have it before. You had seen the incarceration rate, the number of Black folks in prison, drop for the first time in years. You had seen the juvenile correction system, 30% fewer people in there. You had seen Black poverty drop to its lowest level since 1968. You had seen Black businesses rise. You had seen Black income go up. So I could just look at the data and I could say millions of Black folks were better off at the time I left office than when I came in. And what I have to accept, and I think what any president has to accept, is the fact that, okay, so I got 20 million people health care, but there's still 10 million out there who don't have health care, because Republicans blocked me from doing everything I wanted to do with Obamacare, because some states didn't, accept Medicaid dollars, even though it wasn't going to cost them a dime, just because they wanted to oppose me. So if you're Black and you're one of those 10 million who didn't get health care because they live in a state that didn't accept the money we were giving them, I can understand why they would be upset. How come things didn't change?
I think people want to know, like, what did you do specifically for Black people? Not the rising tide lifts all boats types of rhetoric, because we all know Black people's boat got a hole in it. So the systemic things that were done to Black people to put us in these positions, we need specific systemic things to get us out. So
what I'm saying, Charlemagne, is Black poverty dropped faster than everybody else. Black incomes went up more than a lot of other folks. So, the issue is sometimes we just didn't go around advertising that, because once again, the goal here is to build coalitions where everybody is getting something, so that they all feel like they've got a stake in it. But a lot of my policies were targeted towards people most in need, those folks are disproportionately African American. Now, there are some things that, for example, us having a civil rights division in the Justice Department that actually took seriously civil rights and imposed consent decrees on places like Ferguson, and changed sentencing guidelines so that we didn't max out on sentencing for all nonviolent drug offenses, but changed the incentive so that prosecutors were judged not by how long of a sentence you got, but did you get a proportional sentence? Was it a fair sentence? Those kinds of changes that we made, that's why I say there's a reason why the federal prison population dropped. By the way, at the same time, the crime also dropped, right? So we were able to show that you can have a smart strategy in terms of reducing crime without expanding incarceration. But the truth of the matter is, Charlamagne, at the end of the day, there is no way in 8 years to make up for 200 years.
Absolutely.
And the question is constantly, how are you going to, the way I've been describing it, because it's very much how I understand the presidency now. You're like a relay runner. You're getting the baton from somebody else, and all you can do is run your stage of the race, and then you pass it on to the next person. And on either side, both who you got the hit from and who you're passing it to, they may not have the same priorities that you do. You know that you're not going to get everything done that you need to get done, but what you got to do is do your best to get as much done as possible, and I think that's what we did.
Would you say that your intention with this book